very courageous scientists who have had to go against the whole materialistic, physical, reductionistic orientation of the physical sciences. And they've done research in cases where there are like children especially in Buddhist and Hindu countries where the idea of rebirth is accepted, but also children even in countries, Islamic countries, who claim that when they're able to speak, that apart from the parents, their actual biological parents, that they have another set of parents, and they'll describe the situation in which they were living, what their parents looked like, what their house looked like. And these scientists, particularly one was Ian Stevenson, who was at the University of Virginia Medical School. His famous book was called 20 Cases Suggestive of Reincarnation. One can say, this is absolutely convincing proof that rebirth is real, but what he's done is to take all of the facts and line them up and offer different ways to explain this phenomena. And then he says, out of the different explanations, the simplest is that, in this case, consciousness is actually passed from the deceased into a new life. And he's not doing this because he's a convinced, whether he was a Buddhist himself, that I don't know. But he didn't come with like a predisposition to the idea of rebirth, but it was just a topic that interested him and he investigated it. And there's somebody else continuing his investigation, his type of investigation. I don't remember the name of that other scientist. Somebody else? It was a Ravi?
Yes, Bhante. It's a very relevant question that she asked. As a child, I remember reading stories not in Asia, but also in West. There was two children had died in a car crash or whatever, and they had found that, they said that in the previous life, twins were born, and they said that in the previous life, they died together in a crash when they were crossing the street. So these are not children even born in Asia. And recently I read about a story about a young boy who was drawing very violent paintings, and they looked into it and he had said that...
I'm not catching your words.
Yeah, a young boy who was drawing fairly violent drawings, paintings, and he had said that he died when the ship or whatever was in Japan, when they were in that, and it was attacked, probably by the Japanese, and he died. He was an officer in that ship. It was a couple of years ago. I read in the...
Was it a ship or an airplane?
American boy, a young boy.
Was it a ship or an aeroplane?
What?
A ship or an airplane?
Maybe, whatever. Maybe airplane, whatever.
I think I remember something like that.
Probably, I just widely distributed.
A boy, he was able to draw the plane.
Yeah, right.
And...
it was brought down. Whatever it was brought down, and he died there.
Yeah, I think there was YouTube video of it.
Yeah.
A boy who was able, I think he was killed in a plane fight. Maybe it was in World War II.
Right, World War II.
And then he was able to draw the plane in which he was shot down.
And subsequently, they investigated, and they found that that had happened. But there's another little question that I had.
Yeah.
Just a clarification. Sakkaya Ditthi is a dasa Sanyojana. From that, there is a 5, what you call, not attachment, but the 10
fetters.
Fetters, yeah. That one, of course, is with the first stage of enlightenment, not enlightenment, first stage, what do you call, stream enter, yeah. The one you said that we attain arahantship, is that the 8th stage? 8th level, that is the manas? Is that the one? You said once you are enlightened, then you have got rid of it completely.
Yeah.
The concept of Sakkaya Ditthi.
Yeah.
that is at the, what they refer to as manas in the Sanyojana, the 8th one.
Oh, I see, I see. No, that's mano.
Mana, yeah,
Yeah.
Manas.
That is conceit.
Yeah. So is that the one that you said that at that point they are enlightened? At the stage of enlightenment, they won't be having that at all.
What I think the point I was making is that only the Arhat has completely eliminated the conceit I am. Even the stream enterer, once returner, non-returner, still have that conceit I am.
Right. But they say that manas, that at that level, once you attain enlightenment, that's gone also.
Yeah.
So is that the same thing you are referring to?
As far as the conceit I am, that's what I'm referring to. Yeah.
Thank you, Bhante.
But the stream enterer has eliminated the view of self, but not the idea I am.
Bhante, I have a question. I have your chart compare feather and noose in front of me. Restlessness, the ninth feather, is not in anusaya. Can you elaborate why it's not an underlying tendency?
I don't recall coming across any explanation. It was just seemed that the anusayas play a more major role as defilements, whereas restlessness is just a kind of disturbance of the mind. That's all I could guess. Okay, I want to move on now to the last part of the sutta. Okay, so now we come to a section called here it's called the underlying tendencies. These are, in Pali, the anusaya. Okay, so the word anusaya, it comes from the stem saya, which means lying, like lying down, and anu, which means along with. So these are things that lie or sleep along with the flow of the mind. And often the Buddha speaks, as Johnny referred to just before, about 7 anusayas. We see them mentioned in Sutta number 18, the 7 anusaya. This would be on page 202. In section number 8, you speak about the underlying tendency to lust. This is sensual lust. The underlying tendency to aversion or ill will, to views, to doubt, to conceit, to the craving for existence, and the underlying tendency to ignorance. Okay, but in this sutta, this sutta will speak about only 3 anusayas, 3 underlying tendencies or latent tendencies, because this sutta is going to develop or is going to explain the relationship between the underlying tendencies and feelings. And probably this is most relevant because the first part of the sutta developed the scheme of the 6 sixes, and the 5th of the 6s are the 6 types of feelings. And the 6 types of feelings can be divided, or any kind of feeling can be divided into 3 types, looking at it from a different angle. So, let's say we have 6 types of feelings here. By way of sense domain. And then each of these can be divided in terms of its quality into 3, as either pleasant, painful, or neither painful nor pleasant. Okay, so the sutta, this particular sutta, begins, as usual, taking the eye, the organ of vision, as the starting point. So he says that dependent upon the eye and forms, consciousness arises. The meeting of the 3 is contact. With contact, there arises a feeling that is felt as pleasant or painful, or neither painful nor pleasant. Okay, at this point, it's very similar to the first part of the sutta. Okay, but now it's going to tackle the relationship between the feeling and the underlying tendencies. So so the text says, when one is touched by a pleasant feeling, if one delights in it, welcomes it, and remains holding to it, then the underlying tendency to lust, this is the raga anusaya, the latent tendency to lust, lies within one. Or I would say, it's a strange idiom in Pali. I would say, in that case, it's the latent tendency to lust which has now become activated. You know, it's always lying in the dormant state, but it's when the pleasant feeling impinges on the sense, and then one turns to that pleasant feeling, or one turns to the object that arouses the pleasant feeling, and one grasps after the pleasant object because of the pleasant feeling, that occurrence is activating, stimulating, or provoking the underlying tendency to lust. So now that underlying, because of the impact of the pleasant object, the underlying tendency to lust, which had been sleeping, it's now woken up and becomes active. Okay, then in the second case, when one is touched by a painful feeling, if one sorrows, grieves, and laments, weeps, beating one's breast. Do people in America do that? When they're grief-stricken? It seems to be common in Asia, at least in Sri Lanka. Like when somebody loses a loved person, a loved one, oh, my misery. And so one weeps, beating one's breast, and becomes distraught, confused, bewildered, then the underlying tendency to aversion lies within one. Okay, so in this case, there's some painful contact takes place, giving rise to a painful feeling. And then in response to that painful feeling, then that tendency to aversion is woken up and becomes activated. And so then one reacts to the source of the painful feeling, either trying to escape from it, to flee from it, to oppose it and destroy it. And so in this case, aversion is activated, which takes the fear, could take the form of anger, hatred, fear, resentment, annoyance, irritation. All of those are manifestations of this tendency to aversion. Okay, then when one is touched by a neither painful nor pleasant feeling, kind of feeling we call neutral, if one does not understand as it actually is the origination, the passing away, the gratification or enjoyment, the danger or the drawbacks, and the escape in regard to that feeling, then the underlying tendency to ignorance lies within one. Or I would say the underlying tendency to ignorance has become activated. And so, in the case of neutral feeling, in order to overcome the ignorance, one has to see that that neutral feeling is subject to arising, passing away. One has to know what is the enjoyment in that feeling, the pleasant feeling that or the pleasure that lies within that neutral feeling, the drawback in it or the danger, and then the escape or release from it. But if one doesn't understand that, then the underlying tendency to ignorance has become activated. Okay, then the Buddha makes a very powerful statement. He says, that one shall here and now. Let me change the syntax a little bit. With that, without abandoning the underlying tendency to lust for pleasant feeling, without abolishing the underlying tendency to aversion towards painful feeling, without extirpating or uprooting the underlying tendency to ignorance in regard to neither painful nor pleasant feeling, without abandoning ignorance and arousing true knowledge, that one shall here and now make an end of suffering or dukkha, that is impossible. Okay, then the same is developed through the other sense domains. And then we come to the abandoning of the underlying tendencies. Okay, we start off in the same way, up to feeling. Okay, when one is touched by a pleasant feeling, if one does not delight in it, welcome it, and remain holding to it, then the underlying tendency to lust does not lie within one. So it seems to me the way I would sort of reformulate this to myself. Okay, when one is touched by a pleasant feeling, in order to eliminate the underlying tendency to lust, one should not delight in it, welcome it, and remain holding to it. When one delights in the pleasant feeling, then it's reinforcing, strengthening the tendency to lust. But when one is touched by pleasant feeling, if one doesn't delight in it, but restrains the mind so that one experiences the pleasant feeling, but not delighting in it and grasping it, then one is weakening that underlying tendency to lust. And then when one gains insight into the nature of the pleasant feeling, then one eliminates the underlying tendency to lust. Okay, when one is touched by the painful feeling, if one does not sorrow, grieve, and lament, does not weep, and so on, then the underlying tendency to aversion does not lie within one. Again, I would sort of change the word order a little bit or reformulate this to make it more practical. So I would say when one is touched by painful feeling, in order to weaken the underlying tendency to aversion, one should not sorrow, grieve, and lament, weep, and become distraught. You know, the painful feeling will arise, and then the tendency will come up to push away from the painful feeling and become upset and miserable. But if one doesn't become upset and miserable when the painful feeling occurs, but one is able to observe it with equanimity, then one is gradually weakening the tendency to aversion. And then when the insight into the nature of the painful feeling becomes sharp and clear, then one eliminates the underlying tendency to aversion. Is that clear, or is it too abstract? Okay, when one is touched by the neither painful nor pleasant feeling, if one understands its origin, its passing away, and so forth, then the underlying tendency to ignorance does not lie within one. Again, I would sort of reformulate it in a more practical way. When one is touched by the neither painful nor pleasant feeling, one should understand its origin, passing away, gratification, danger, and escape. And in that way, one will be weakening the underlying tendency to ignorance. And when one gains a very clear insight into these things, then one will eradicate the underlying tendency to ignorance. Okay, then the Buddha sort of sums up, he says, again, I'll just change the syntax a bit. Okay. That by abandoning the underlying tendency to lust for a pleasant feeling, by abolishing the underlying tendency to aversion towards painful feeling, by uprooting the underlying tendency to ignorance in regard to the neutral feeling, by abandoning ignorance and arousing true knowledge, that one shall here and now make an end to suffering. This is possible. This is possible. Okay, and then the same thing is unfolded according to the other 5 senses. We might as well just wrap up the sutta. Okay, then what comes at the very end is just the usual sequence that we encounter again and again. Okay, seeing thus, the well-taught noble disciple becomes disenchanted with the eye, disenchanted with forms, consciousness, eye contact, feeling, craving, becoming disenchanted. I'm jumping over the other senses. He becomes dispassionate. Through dispassion, the mind is liberated. When it is liberated, there comes the knowledge. It is liberated, and he understands birth is finished. That is, the cycle of repeated births is finished. The holy life has been lived. What had to be done has been done. There is no more coming back to any state of being. Okay, then the very last statement of this sutta is not the usual ending where the monks delight in the Buddha's saying and that's it. But there's an additional sentence here which maybe underscores the importance of the discourse. Okay, so this is what the Buddha said. The monks were satisfied and delighted in the Buddha's words. Now, while this discourse was being spoken, through not clinging, the minds of 60 bhikkhus were liberated from the taints. Okay, that is the end of the sutta, but then there's a note here referring to the commentary. You see, there's a tendency in Buddhist literature for numbers to keep on increasing and increasing and increasing. So the early stage, say the minds of 60 monks were liberated, and an early person in the early period hearing that would think, wow, 60 monks achieved arhatship. That's fantastic. But a few centuries later, they would be thinking, 60 monks achieved arhatship. That's like saying that some real estate developer has constructed a 10-story building, a skyscraper. In the 20th century, 21st century, we hear somebody has built a 10-story building. What? Nothing to be excited about. So a few centuries later, 60 monks, not enough. We have to have 60,000. And then by the time you get to the Mahayana Sutras, it's 60 billion monks achieved arhatship. 60 nayutas, 60 kodis of nayutas. Okay, so the commentary says, there is nothing wonderful in the fact that 60 monks achieved arhatship when the Buddha first taught the sutta. But each time Sariputta, Moggallana, and the 80 great disciples taught it, 60 monks attained arhatship. In Sri Lanka, the elder Malayadeva taught the sutta in 60 places, and each time 60 monks attained arhatship. And when the elder Tripitaka master Chula Naga taught the sutta to a vast assembly of humans and gods, at the end of the discourse, 1,000 bhikkhus attained arhatship, and among the gods, only one remained a worldling. So it seems a bit like, the Buddha teaches it, and 60 achieve arhatship. How could he claim to be the Buddha when his disciples are surpassing him? Okay, so if there are any questions and matters that could be cleared up quickly, then we'll take those questions now. Otherwise, we'll come back for discussion after the meal.
Bhante, at the end it says they're liberated from the taints. Yeah. That's asava?
That's the asavas.
So that's separate from the anusaya.
Because in the suttas, the attainment of liberation is always expressed as being liberated from the asavas. Always. It's never stated that way in terms of the anusayas. Okay, I don't see any hands raised, so we'll just end with the sharing of the merits. That was another cause of my trepidation back in those early days when giving first Dhamma talks. Are there any questions? Nobody raises the hand. Then I think probably nobody was paying attention. Was everybody paying attention? Okay. So maybe I'll ask some questions when we come back after lunch. Okay, so let us do the okay, yeah, you printed this out here. Okay, because I brought the ones that we prepared last week. I brought them back to my room, saying I'll bring them next week. Excuse me? Okay, so we'll do the sharing of the merits. Akasata chabumata deva naga mahidika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu sasanang. Akasata chabumata deva naga mahidika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu desanang. Akasata chabumata deva naga mahidika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu mang parang. Etavatacham hehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe devanumodantu sabbasampati siddhya. Etavatacham hehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe bhutanumodantu sabbasampati siddhya. Etavatacham hehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe satanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Pavagupadaya avichihetato etantare satakayupapanna rupya rupicha sanya sanyino dukkha pamuchantu pusantu nibuting. Okay, we end with 3 half bows to the Buddha. Okay, since